Cek satu dua, cek cek. Suara dari luar gimana? Hmm? Cek satu dua tiga. Masuk ya? Ya, delay. Oke. Sudah banyak. Pokoknya jaga-jaga siapa tahu ada video ini.
Cek satu dua. Cek cek. Gimana Mas Supri?
Bagus, Mas.
Cek satu. Bagus.
Terus,
Coba lagi dari dalam Mas.
cek, cek, satu, dua, dua. Cek, cek,
Sorry lagi. Agak agak
cek,
ini.
satu, dua, dua. Sebentar, Mas, saya
Itu dekat mulut ya?
laptop dulu. Apa? Cek, cek, cek,
Oke sih, oke.
satu, dua, dua. Cek, satu, dua, dua. Cek, 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 sip. Satu, dua, tiga. Masuk ya? Kalau di laptop saya, Mas. Masuk. Cek, cek, satu, dua, tiga.
Cek satu dua.
Cek, cek. Satu, dua, tiga. Cek. Satu, dua, tiga. Udah. Cek. Satu, dua, tiga.
Kamu nggak akan geser ke aku kan? Pas aku ngomong, ya sejauh ini aja nggak apa. Oh, geser aja nggak apa. Ojo, apa bisa? Bisa. Yang tiganya kamu udah. Enggak, maksudnya kameranya. Jangan. Ya nggak apa. Jangan. Enggak, tidak. Aku di sini, aku di sini. Kamu aja akan lihat.
Mas Angga,
Halo, gimana kan?
Mas udah join ke Zoom-nya dulu Mas. Nanti aku jadiin MC.
Udah, sorry, aku WG7. Sorry.
Oh gitu ya. Oke oke. MC apa host?
Ya.
Tes tes. Kedengeran nggak? Enggak. Enggak.
Kedengeran.
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 Aku coba ini ku, mic-ku.
Nanti kalau ada orang
Seperti.
ya, jangan bicara lewat Zoom ya, maksudnya jangan di-unmute Zoom-nya. Lewat ini nih.
Maksudnya kalau bicara?
Kan kadang tuh orang ini
Suara aku kan?
Tes. Mas.
Nah ini kemana ya biar suaranya terlalu ya.
Mas. Masuk. Masuk, Mbak. Oke. Oh, masuk duluan ya? Masuk duluan, tapi nggak boleh. Oh, itunya di aja. Oke, Mas. Apakah masuk? Oke.
Berarti nanti
Iya.
kecil itu.
Ya.
Sebenarnya persoalan saya hingga
Tahu nggak? Pak Islam tahu.
Tadi baru sama Pak Horizon, sama Mister from USA. Ini lagi di Congress.
Ya,
Ntar habis selesai acara, Mbak ada kegiatan.
ada. Abis ini Mas Faton disuruh pertanggungjawaban. Ngeprint sih.
Oh gitu.
Ini, yang ini.
Nggak, saya mau diskusi sebentar.
Oh iya,
Ya.
nggak apa-apa. Ya.
Mas Haris di depan.
Ifah, Pak. Ya. Professor of Medicine from Chicago College of Law. Good morning and welcome to Head of Research Center for Dr. and all participants today. May I have your attention, please? The ceremony will start immediately. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning and welcome everyone in the workshop lecture series, Normative Jurisprudence and Critical Theory, presented by Research Center for Law, National Research and Innovation Agency, Monday, May 77, 2025. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for taking the time to attend this event. My name is Rusty, as your master of ceremony today. Now let's begin the opening remark from Head of Research Center for Law. Please welcome Dr. Nur Hidayah. Thank you, Mbak Moderator. Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for coming to. I think this one is a special guest lecture. We are very honored to have Professor Ralph Donaldson from Chicago College of Law. Actually, he is the supervisor for Mas Harrison Citra from his PhD. Welcome to Jakarta, Professor Ralph. Thank you for coming to our research center for National Research and Innovation Agency. Actually, today we talk about, he will talk about the normative jurisprudence and a critical race theory. Probably this kind of lecture will be beneficial for us. Like when we already in our research center talk about critical race theory. Probably this is the conceptual theory from US, right? In Indonesia, we have some of discrimination. Probably it's happened in 1998, where there was a riot in Indonesia, in Jakarta, where there's a Soeharto step down. So probably there's some like anti-Chinese in Indonesia. Probably there's also a problem with Papua, probably in the US also, that we have a different color, like Java and then Papua, probably. But in Indonesia, this kind of debate and discussion about the race term and etc. is not really a hot topic. Like we mostly talk about human rights and talk about something related to so probably this talk will give us our insight. So probably before that, we will. I will introduce our research center. Research Center for Law is established in 2022 research center at the National Innovation Agency. We have 7 research cluster for our research. First is on criminal law, intellectual property law, business law, environmental and climate change and natural resources. There's also human rights and gender research cluster and state law, and I think research cluster is Samsung Citrawan gender theory doctrine or theory. So he is the expert of this doctrine or philosophy of law. So without further ado, I will open this guest lecture and thank you, and please I will back to the moderator. Thank you, Randy. Ladies and gentlemen, for presentation and discussion session, we will have a photo session before. Then we invite you to join in front of the person.
Di sini, Ibu taruh di sini. Nanti yang belakang Bapak Ibu bisa. Di mana? Mau dekat lift? Mau di mana? Boleh? Oh, oke.
Foto dulu Bapak.
Kaget aku di sini. Aku belum baca kamu. Aku nggak masalah soalnya lagi. Ini yang
Ladies and gentlemen, workshop lectures are today with a discussion about normative jurisprudence and critical race theory with Professor Raffi Nelson from Metropolitan College of Law, USA. And to moderating the discussion is the analyst Indriani SHMK. Now, please welcome to Ibu Dewi and Prof. Raffi Nelson. Ibu Dewi, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mbak Resti. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session of our guest lecture series by the Legal Theories and Doctrine Research Group under the auspices of the Research Center for Law. My name is Dewi Analis, and I will be your moderator and for this exciting and insightful event. Our theme today is Normative Jurisprudence and Critical Race Theory, and we are honored to have with us a distinguished scholar in the field, Professor Raffi Nelson. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Raffi Nelson. Professor Nelson is an associate professor of law and philosophy from Chicago Kent College of Law, whose research focuses on issues at the intersection of jurisprudence, constitutional law, police and criminal procedure, and critical race theory. His work critically examines the normative foundations of law and how race and legal structures interact. Today's lecture will provide us with valuable insight into normative jurisprudence and the critical perspective offered by race theory. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ralph Donaldson. Time is yours.
It's coming up. Perfect. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you for the invitation. This is my first time in Indonesia. It's really been wonderful so far. So the conversation today will be about normative jurisprudence and critical race theory. Next slide. So here is the trajectory or roadmap for my remarks. First, I'll talk some about what critical race theory is. Next, I'll talk about why critical race theory is illegal in certain places in the US today. And then finally, I'll talk about how critical race theory can be useful as a tool outside the US. So first, what is critical race theory? I understand there's not a lot of conversation about that here, so I will try to help us see what it is. So I'll give a brief history of this movement to kind of help you see where it sits in American legal tradition. So at the turn of the 20th century, there was a movement that started in the US, mostly centered in the northeast part of the country at Yale Law School and the Harvard Law School. And this movement, called legal realism, had a couple of key insights. One of the main insights of legal realism is that the legal tests that judges used to determine legal outcomes, that these tests were flexible, that the tests could be used to find one outcome or find a different outcome. The suggestion by the legal realists was that there was a lot of flexibility or uncertainty or indeterminacy in legal rules. Maybe too much flexibility. But what this flexibility allowed is maybe good things to happen, but it also allowed decision makers who had bias to have biased outcomes happen. So this is one of the insights of legal realism. And this movement, to repeat, was centered in the US and around the 1920s and 30s, and there were major legal realist thinkers from that time. A little bit later came the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s. This movement had lots of different actors in it. Perhaps the most famous is Martin Luther King Jr. In the US. The key thing about this movement, its key inspiration, is that under American law, there were formal designations of different treatment based on race. To give one example, if one wanted to attend law school in the US in, say, the 1940s, there were law schools for Black students and different law schools for white students. And the law schools for white students were much, much better than the law schools for white students. In one case, there was a discussion of the law school for Black students. The law school for Black students only had 2 professors, whereas the law school for the white students had 30. So there were very many formal race-based discriminations in American law. Often Blacks were not permitted to vote in many places in the United States, and there were other restrictions. The Civil Rights Movement had at its aim to eliminate these formal distinctions based on race. The most important lawsuit that happened during this time happened in 1954, a case called Brown v. Board of Education, which was a case about whether school-age children, 10, 12, these sorts of ages, whether the state could require them to go to different schools, a school for Blacks and a school for whites. And the United States Supreme Court decided in 1954 in Brown that it would be illegal going forward to require different schools based on race. So that is an important moment that we'll return to for critical race theory. The next moment that I'll talk about in the development of critical race theory is the critical legal studies movement. Critical legal studies was a movement that began at law schools here, again, mostly in the Northeast at Harvard, but there were some important conferences among law professors in the middle of the country and Minnesota. And here, critical legal studies picked up on some of the themes of legal realism. The critical legal studies scholars pointed out other kinds of uncertainty that rules would allow, that certain legal rules allowed. One kind of example that critical legal studies scholars sometimes pointed out is that there are rules that are meant to help certain groups of people, but because they are very flexible, they may end up not helping those people at all. They may end up helping very different people. To give one very prominent example, the civil rights movement cases about formal discrimination in schools, one way that the courts enforced this rule is to require Black children from Black neighborhoods to be educated in schools with whites. In order for that to happen, the Black students had to go from the Black neighborhoods to where the white schools were. They were often very far apart. So there were buses that would take the Black students from their school, from their neighborhoods to the white schools. Sometimes these trips would take hours. Now, you live in Jakarta where there's lots of traffic, so maybe you're used to that. But these school-age children would sometimes have to take many hours to go to these white schools. And when they were there, often they would face violence or teasing from the white kids that were there. It is not clear whether this intervention actually helped those Black children or not. Recall the case that I was mentioning about the two law schools, the Black law school and the white law school. One problem might have been that there were separate schools, a Black one and a white one. But a different problem is that one law school only had 2 professors and the other had more. You might think perhaps the way to have equality, even if there are separate schools, is to ensure that they have the same resources. But this is not what happened with the elementary schools. They were not given equal resources. Instead, the idea was to send the Black kids on buses to the white schools. And when this didn't happen, there were lawsuits. And often, the people, the lawyers in the cases sued to ensure that the Black kids really did get on the buses and go to the schools were white lawyers. And so some of the critical legal studies scholars pointed out, this was a rule that was supposed to help Black students. Maybe it does not help Black students, but helps white lawyers get attorney's fees. This is just one example of how critical legal studies scholars pointed out how certain legal rules can have as their effect unintended consequences. Critical race theory was a movement that grew out of all three of these. Critical race theory began as a movement mostly within critical legal studies, but eventually they split off to be their own movement. They sought to make themselves different from the civil rights movement and its concern for greater racial equality, but also in important ways different from the critical legal studies movement too. So next, I'll talk some about what, in particular, critical race theorists believe. Next slide. So here is a very basic set of ideas from critical race theory. Most important, critical race theorists claim that legal phenomenon get their full explanation by centering race, that is, by talking about race, and legal phenomenon get their full explanation not by focusing on explicit mental processes like people's beliefs. I'll explain this more in a moment. But the key idea is we learn more about how the law really works if we investigate how it works racially. And we understand how the law really works when we don't focus on how people report their beliefs, but we instead focus on other sorts of things like biases or other things below the level of beliefs. Connected to that, critical race theorists claim that when we hide how race works, we hide how inequality operates. The second basic idea of critical race theory is that law is unlikely to bring about racial equality. This is very shocking to many, that law would not be a tool to bring about racial equality. The civil rights movement, of course, was a movement about law created in order to bring about greater racial equality. And in some ways, it did. For instance, I am a Black law professor. 60 years ago, there were almost no Black law professors at all. When I began my first job as a law professor, I was the third Black law professor hired at my school ever. So, law has brought about greater equality, racial equality than before. A critical race theorist believes that it's unlikely to fully bring about racial equality. And the main reason why many critical race theorists believe this is that they believe what they call the convergence thesis. The convergence thesis claims that law that is meant to help racial minorities will succeed only if they can also help whites. So to give two examples. First was the example that I gave before about the busing. You might think forcing a bunch of new students into a school, which will put strain on teachers and other things, will be bad for the white students who are already at the school. And in some ways, that's true, it was. according to critical race theorists, the reason why the government allowed this to happen is that there are parts of white society, namely the loyal class of people, who actually benefited from having this arrangement. To give a broader example, a more controversial example, many people argue, many critical race theorists argue, that the reason why the United States ended racial segregation when it did in 1954 was actually because of its competition with the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, the Cold War, as you all know, featured a global competition between the United States and the Soviet Union about which countries would ally with which blocs. And the United States and the Soviet Union were both very eager to have African nations ally with them. However, many African nations would be very skeptical about allying with the United States if the way that Black people in the United States were treated was very awful. Whereas the Soviet Union actually made lots of propaganda suggesting that racial minorities would be treated very well in the Soviet Union. Who knows what to say about that? But the United States was very conscious of winning a war of public support among African nations. And so it was important geopolitically for the United States to change its treatment of Blacks within the country. So the convergence thesis says the only reason why the United States finally changed is because of this geopolitical reason, not because of underlying ideas about truly promoting genuine equality. Next slide. So now I'll talk about a few more of the critical race theory commitments to get a sharper idea about the movement. So first, now the US has basically no laws that explicitly divide people on the basis of race. There's no mention of race in almost any laws. One is not sent to different schools on the basis of race. There's no jobs that are not open or are open on the basis of race. There are no tax laws that are different on the basis of race. But critical race theorists point out that while the law explicitly is colorblind, it has no mention of race. This is misleading. And laws that require us not to talk about race, not to talk about how race affects one's life chances, but these obscure or hide how inequality operates. And I'll give some examples soon. Second commitment is what I call the convergence thesis, that law meant to help minorities can succeed only if it also helps whites. Third commitment of critical race theory is that race is a kind of social construction. Critical race theorists believe that how we understand what a race is, who counts as being a member of a race, is a matter of social construction and not a matter of biology. Fourth, critical race theorists believe in what they call intersectional approaches to understanding oppression. To give an example, in the United States, Black people earn less money than white people, And on average, men earn more money than women. And so you might think that means that Black men earn more money than Black women, but they don't. And there are some reasons about why that's true, about men who end up in prison for one reason or other. But what intersectional approaches mean is that different parts of identity can combine in ways that change how the oppression operates. Finally, fifth, critical race theorists believe that race is erased in too many legal conversations. And so I'll give some examples to show how these theories play out in practice. So this is a quote from Paul Butler, who is a famous critical race theorist who is also on TV sometimes in the United States. The quote says this: "These cases," and he's talking about Terry v. Ohio and Virginia v. Moore, "these cases and others described below evidence a racial project by the United States Supreme Court to allow the police to control African American men." So I will tell you what these cases are so you can understand why Professor Butler believes this. Terry v. Ohio is a case about police who are watching men on the street. These men are walking by a store, looking into the windows of the store in the day. Perhaps they wanted to buy something from the store. But the police grabbed the men and searched them. One of the men was carrying a gun without a license. Now, this case reached the United States Supreme Court because typically the police are not allowed to grab someone and search them without probable cause, which is a certain level of evidence that the person has committed a crime. Because these men were merely walking by the store and looking in the windows, that is not probable cause. But the Supreme Court said that this was okay. They said that this was okay because when there is just a light search, then police don't need probable cause. This was a case decided under the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The amendment was ratified in 1791. This case is from 1968. In almost 200 years, the court had never decided that police could just search people without probable cause, but suddenly this was allowed. In Virginia v. Moore, this was a case about a man who was driving in his car, and I'm forgetting the details, but I believe there was something wrong with his license plate. Under Virginia law, it is, if police notice this, they're to stop you and issue a ticket for you to pay. But instead, the police arrested this man and searched him and put him in jail, contrary to what Virginia law allowed. This went to the United States Supreme Court, and the court said again, this was okay. The law under Virginia said that this person could not be arrested. The Supreme Court said it was still okay. Professor Butler points out these cases because These are cases where the Supreme Court has given new expanded powers to the police, and these powers will be used disproportionately to arrest and jail Black men. Black men in the United States are much more likely to be arrested and thrown in jail than any other population in the country. And this is permitted in part by these expanded powers the Supreme Court has given. Next slide. I'll give a very different example about how race operates. Two couples. Couple one, the husband earns $200,000 per year, and the wife stays home with the children. Couple two, the husband earns $100,000, and the wife earns $100,000, and who knows who takes care of the children. Under American law, though both couples earn the very same amount of money, $200,000, couple one would pay $4,995 less in taxes. So I'll explain why in a moment, but the important thing for our purposes is that couple one is more likely to be white, while couple two is more likely to be Black. Why is that? It's more traditional and has long been more traditional for white families to have a husband who works and a wife who stays at home. Black families have not ever been like that in the US. And there's a very easy reason why that's the case. In the US, there was chattel slavery. Black people were enslaved, and men and women were enslaved and forced to work. And so, once there was freedom, this pattern didn't change. Both Black men and Black women often went out to work. It was not common for Black women to just stay at home. Often because of racial discrimination, Black men did not earn enough money that their wife could just stay home anyway. So it is much more common for a Black family, for both the husband and wife, to go out and work. And of course, it's also more common for them together not to earn as much money as a white family. So that is why the couples are more likely to be of the different races. Now, why? Why do they pay different in taxes? Well, it's slightly complicated, but there's one relatively easy way to explain it. Some of the taxes that we have to pay have a cap. That is, you only have to pay it on a certain amount of your income. So, what are called sometimes employment taxes, you only have to pay that on a certain amount of your taxes. So, I think this year, you only have to pay the employment taxes on the first $170,000 of your income. So the next $30,000 is tax-free for the employment tax. So if in couple one, the husband earns $200,000, he has, and suppose it's $170,000, that $30,000 is tax-free. However, in couple two, they are not under law permitted to pool the money. So the husband pays the full tax on his $100,000, and the wife also pays the full tax on her $100,000. And so, as a consequence, couple one will pay less taxes than couple two. This is the kind of thing that critical race theorists point out we need have more information about. No one explicitly said we are going to make a tax system that gives more favorable treatment to white people than Black people. The tax code has no mention of race at all. However, there are different patterns by which people from different races live, and that has racial consequences. And if we don't talk about race, we don't even notice it. Next slide. So I've told you some about what critical race theory is. So why is it illegal to teach critical race theory in some places in the US? So 44 states of our 50 states have had some anti-critical race theory bill introduced in their state legislatures. So we have a federal system where there are state governments, and each of them has a relative amount of autonomy to regulate how the schools and universities work within them, if they are public. And so in 44 of the 50 states, there have been some legislation introduced. As you can see in the blue, these are states where the bills were actually successful and they are now law. This is a kind of rough map of what the US looks like. So these are concentrated in the southeast part of the country, which tends to be more politically conservative. But there are bills that have been introduced all over and successful all over. What do these laws say? Well, let's talk about it. This is one bill that became law in Arizona. There's a lot of text here. I don't expect you to read it all. I will give you an overview of what it says. So in Arizona schools, it is illegal to teach the following things. It is illegal to teach that one race is more intellectually superior to another race, those sorts of things. It is illegal to say that someone's moral character is determined by someone's race. These sorts of things are uncontroversial. No one who promotes critical race theory says things like this. However, there are some things that are more curious. For instance, number 7 says it is illegal to teach that academic achievement, meritocracy, or traits such as hard work ethic are racist. They were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. Now, why is this here, and why does this bother critical race theorists? Well, sometimes things that are called academic achievement or merit are racist or were created in order to oppress members of a particular race. To give one example, suppose that are hiring for a job and you hope to hire the person who has the best academic resume. And so you decide you will hire from only certain universities. For instance, in Louisiana, where I began my career, the best public university was Louisiana State University. And so suppose you decide I will only hire from, I'm in Louisiana, I will hire from Louisiana State University. Okay. Well, when Louisiana State University was founded, it was a rights-only institution. And when it was initially challenged in court for being against the law, the state built a separate university called Southern University, just down the road. And they said Blacks could go there. And Blacks did go there. Now, it is illegal to forbid Blacks to go to Louisiana State University, but they have been told for generations, either you cannot go here, we don't really want you here, you should go to the other school. This is why, when I began my career teaching at Louisiana State University, I was the third Black person ever hired in the law school. Even though the school was founded in the 1860s. So, someone who hires only from Louisiana State University might think that they are being meritocratic. It is true, Louisiana State University is more difficult to attend than the other school. And so it is, you know, a better school, but this has a racial history that is ignored when we're focusing merely on the merit of the students. And there are other examples of this kind. And so critical race theorists are often concerned about how academic achievement and merit are truly measured. To give one more example about why critical race theorists are concerned about laws like this in Arizona, consider number 5. Number 5 says an individual, by virtue of their race, bears responsibility. So, excuse me, it is illegal to teach that an individual, by virtue of their race, is responsible for actions committed by members of the same race. Now, of course, everyone knows that we are responsible for the things that we individually do. I am not responsible for things that my mother does, nor is she responsible for things that I do, which is good. Critical race theorists often point out that sometimes people, by virtue of their race, get certain benefits that they did not deserve because of their race. And perhaps those things that they got that they did not deserve, they should give back to people who did. The simplest example, of course, is American slavery. Blacks were forced to work and were not paid for this work. This work went on farms, and those farms sowed crops and made certain landowners very wealthy. And those landowners are very rich now. But the workers are not. And their descendants are not. Of course, my family was among the people who worked on these farms in North Carolina, but no benefit have I ever received from the years of labor on these racist slavery plantations. But maybe there are things even more recent than slavery, which ended over a century ago. As I mentioned, the civil rights movement was more recent. It was from the previous century, in the 1950s. And even then, there are all sorts of discrimination that give whites additional benefits, again, perhaps that they did not deserve. To give an example that you're already now familiar with, if there are state universities, everyone's taxes goes to pay for the state universities, but Blacks were not allowed to attend them. So whites are getting spots in these universities paid for with Black people's dollars. This is a kind of unfairness and inequality. And maybe some of those Black students who would have loved to become lawyers or doctors, engineers, could not become these things. And they've lost money, real amounts of money that they could have earned. But that is withheld. And there are other people who reap the benefits of those things. So critical race theorists do not say, for instance, that someone who lives now, a white person now, who is the child of one of those wealthy landowners, or who is the child of a doctor who benefited from the times when Blacks could not compete with them for spots in medical schools. It's not that that child is responsible for those previous conditions, but it may well be that the wealth that they have been allowed to accumulate because of past inequality should be repaid to the Blacks whose descendants currently live. Next slide. This is an extremely similar, as you can see. I list this not to tell you the same things again, but to tell you something else about how these bills work. So in the United States, when certain private organizations get ideas for laws, they often go to every state and give the same information to the legislators and persuade them through promises of campaign contributions to pass the very same bill. And so this is why in 44 states we had bills introduced, and in the states where it passed, they often were identical, just like this one. So Arizona, you saw the one, South Carolina, so you see the other one, and you see they're in the very same year. Many of these were all introduced within 6 months. So the organizations, very well-funded organizations who did not like critical race theory, and might start to imagine why, because some critical race theorists are talking about the redistribution of income and wealth from wealthy whites to non-white people. So some of those wealthy white people formed organizations to forbid the teaching of critical race theory in American schools. North Dakota, however, was different in that it had a very different law about critical race theory. In North Dakota, it is illegal to teach critical race theory. And it is the theory that racism is not merely the product of learned individual bias or prejudice, but that racism is systematically embedded in American society and the American legal system to facilitate racial inequality. Unlike many of the other bills, which mischaracterize critical race theory, this is actually correct. This is what critical race theory claims. Racism is not just about people having biased beliefs, not liking people over there. Instead, often things get set up in such a way that benefits certain groups and harms other groups, and little is done to change it, in part because the people who are powerful do not see a reason to change it. And so North Dakota realizes this, and it is now illegal to teach that. Now, I will say something, one more thing about how and where it is legal. So I teach at a private university and have no restrictions on teaching critical race theory. I was teaching critical race theory last month in my classes to my students. But many of these bills focus first on public universities, not private universities. Excuse me, when they focus at all on universities, they focus on public, not private. Also, most of these focus on high school and elementary school. It is illegal to teach these there, not at universities. Now, what is interesting from the perspective of a scholar like me, critical race theory was not often taught in high schools or elementary schools in the first place. And so it seems like all of these laws are a solution in search of a problem. But who am I to tell the wealthy lobbyists where to spend their money? Next slide. So the last thing that I'll talk about before concluding my remarks is about whether and how critical race theory can be useful outside the US. Obviously, the history of this movement is very US focused. It began in the US, most of the scholars are US, most of the cases that we discuss and particular laws are all American. Is this useful for other parts of the world? So I think maybe, depending on the kind of country we're talking about. So I'll give two kinds of examples. One where I think critical race theory is useful, and one where I think maybe not as much. So I'll start with France. In France, state policy makes it very difficult to collect data about race. The census doesn't have data about race, from what I understand. So it's very hard to talk about the racial effects of particular laws. We know that there is some racial animosity between the European French people and the North Africans who are mostly Muslim in the country, but it is hard to collect data. Critical race theory seems like it would be very helpful for France because the very same dynamics that critical race theorists in the US concern themselves with are present in France. There is an official policy of color blindness, but this may obscure or hide the ways that race colors and shapes people's experience with the law. And so critical race theory might be a really good development there. Take a very different example, like apartheid South Africa before the democratic elections of 1994. There, race was not obscured or hidden at all. There were rules about race everywhere in society, about things that you could do and places that you could go. You had to have a card that had your race information on it. In apartheid South Africa, critical race theory wouldn't really be useful. No one is wondering, does race affect things? Yes, obviously, race affects everything in apartheid South Africa. So I would think in a country like that, where it is patently obvious how race affects so many aspects of everyone's daily life, from policing to tax to housing, that you don't really need a critical theory. What you need is something like the US civil rights movement to explain how we can have formal equality again. And now South Africa does have that. The democratic elections of 1994 and the ongoing political regime there is one where there is formal equality. However, now I think you might need critical race theory in South Africa because it is one of the most unequal societies on earth. And it is split still between the Black indigenous population and the white post-colonizing portion of the civilization. So I think from the apartheid time, critical race theory wouldn't have been necessary. What you just need is basic civil rights discourse. But now, I think critical race theory would be very helpful in South Africa to understand things about life expectancy being very different between races in South Africa, and housing being very different, and income and other sorts of things. I think that there may be an interesting comparison here to draw between in the Israel-Palestine situation. I think similarly, there is no need right now to have a critical race theory to understand that society. Obviously, one's race or one's ethnicity maybe matters a lot legally in Israel, Palestine. And so you don't need to go investigate all the ways that the law shapes one's life's chances as a Palestinian. Yes, obviously, right? So in societies where there are multiple races, and where, formally speaking, there is no official discrimination, it seems like it's possible for critical race theory to investigate whether race does affect people's life chances, whether race does make things better for some people, worse for others. Those are places where the tools of critical race theory to investigate whether there are differences and how those come about, where critical race theory might be useful. I don't know if that's here too, but we can investigate. That concludes my remarks, and thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Danielson, for that enlightenment and thought-provoking presentation. We now have some time for question and answer. If you have any question for Professor Danielson, please raise your hand in this room or on Zoom, and I will call on you. Alternatively, you can type your question into the chat box, and I will read them out. Any question? Ada pertanyaan Bapak Ibu tentang critical race theory? Bisa, boleh, silakan.
Terima kasih. Saya minta maaf karena saya harus bertanya dengan bahasa Indonesia. Yang pertama saya ingin bertanya terkait dengan critical race theory ini. Ini letak normativitas. Karena kan ketika dijelaskan tadi, alurnya itu dari kalau tadi saya melihat itu sebagai ideologi, secara prinsipil itu tertentu. Saya bertanya, apakah ini mungkin itu saya.
Itu saja pertanyaannya. Ya, dengan Bapak Syed, apa namanya, Mas?
Maaf, saya Rega. Baru
Ya, Regan. Regan dari FUI, Indonesian Universitas Hukum Indonesia. Ya, oke. Terima kasih, Mas. Bapak Ibu yang lain ada pertanyaan? Tidak apa-apa kalau menggunakan bahasa Indonesia. Nanti ada Mas Harisan. Ada Mas Harisan. Atau yang di Zoom silakan kalau ada mau bertanya. Ada satu dulu. Oke, satu dulu. Nanti kita lanjut lagi.
So the question, if I understood it, is critical race theory an ideology or a theory? If it is a theory, where is its kind of normativity? Good. So I think it's controversial whether it's an ideology versus a theory. So that's the first thing. I think that's controversial. Where is its normativity? I'm not sure whether I believe that it is a fully normative theory. I think it aims to be a mostly descriptive theory about how legal change happens and what legal phenomena are likely to happen. So to give a very simple kind of example, the US had laws that explicitly forbid Black people from moving into certain neighborhoods. So very clear racial discrimination. Those were made illegal with the Fair Housing Act in the 1960s. An outside observer might believe if you remove the formal discrimination, then we will have an egalitarian system of housing. Critical race theorists would predict that you would not, that there would be some different mechanism that would arise to ensure that it's still not racially equal. And they would set out to track or discover what are the methods that create this lack of racial equality. So in that way, that's not a normative theory about what should happen. It's a predictive theory about what will happen. And it is true that it is still the case that Black people are less likely to own their own housing than whites are. Black people's houses are worth less money than whites are. And so many of the problems that we thought we would address with the Fair Housing Act have not been fixed 60 years later. And so that's the kind of thing critical race theorists try to show. They try to show that racism or racially discriminate outcomes are a permanent or semi-permanent feature of American life. And so they may become hidden, but they are unlikely to be eliminated. And so yeah, you might think of a claim like that as ideological, but that's, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ralph Donaldson. Ada lagi? Any question? Ya, Ibu silakan Bu. Professor Donaldson. Actually, it is interesting. Like in this still racial discrimination. So, like for example, in Indonesia, probably one of the case with eliminate the discrimination in the Chinese, for example, the President siapa ya? Abdullah Wahid Gus Dur is he yeah there is some of the that hinder some of Chinese to have like to have right to perform the culture and etc. And have the same equality also the yeah, I mean it's remove this law and then change to the one to weather equality. And for example, with Papua also, President Jokowi probably he informed Papua and like with the Japanese, it is one of the official government official is from Papua, so he promote government official is from Papua, so to make it a better equality with other like Japanese and etc. But I know that in the implementation still there's superiority. Java people is more superior probably than Papua. So yeah, still this discrimination still there. So what I mean, how to eliminate? I mean, how is now the trend in US? Like, is it racial discrimination in black lives matter, something related to that, the campaign or etc. is or maybe political will from the president, the higher level, could eliminate this discrimination? Or you said that there's two problem. One is the American society, embedded this racial discrimination in American society, and then the one is legal problem. So do you think what need to be done to help like yeah have better equality in the US society? Like you say, the critical race theory is illegal. I mean, is it good or bad? I mean, for the for the equality. So that's my question.
That's a big question. So I'll start with the last part. Is it good or bad to make critical race theory illegal? Bad. That's simple. Now, what do you have to do to eliminate racial inequality? The reason why this is really hard to answer is that there's so much racial inequality, and it's not uncontroversial whether some of it is a problem. So to give one example, I was just talking in front of the county government in Chicago last month. Black men commit more crimes than white men in the US. Every statistic, it's clear. So Black men are sent to prison more often than white men too, obviously. Now, it's also true that for the very same crime, it is more likely that you will be sent to prison if you're Black than if you're not. So that is a kind of discrimination, and we could work on that. But what about the underlying fact that Black men commit more crimes in the first place? That just a cultural difference and not a problem to consider? Is that the consequence of some other inequality that does need to be fixed? For instance, so what I was talking about with the government is after school programs. Someone isn't muted. In certain Black neighborhoods, the schools have very few programs for students to do after school. There's not very much sports, there's not very many, performing arts, nothing really to do. And both of the parents work because, as I mentioned before, Black men and Black women usually both work. So the kids come home and they get into trouble, and sometimes that sends them to jail. However, in many white neighborhoods, the schools are much better, and there are lots of after-school programs, whether it's you can learn languages, you can learn art, you can do debate, you can do theater. I went to a school like this. It was a majority white school, and it was really nice. I did theater and dance. I can't do either very well, but there are lots of opportunities. The decision not to provide funding to the Black schools for after-school programs may lead these young children to start getting into trouble. And then when you start getting into a little trouble when you're younger, then you start getting into more trouble when you get older. And then that might try to explain the different level of crime. And so there are so many levels to the inequality. Is this just cultural, or is it because of the after-school programs? I was arguing at the county government that the school programs, and I was proposing a program for more performing arts for certain students. But this is controversial, and it's just one of so many different areas. So lots of different sorts of things need to be proposed in order to bring about more equality. And some critical race theorists are more optimistic than the lot. Some of them think racism and discrimination is here to stay, and it's our job just to investigate it. But some of us think that maybe some of it can be eliminated if we take the appropriate measures. And so, but there are many, many measures to take.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. Ibu ada tanggapan? Ya. Communication from anyone? Ada. Rizky, silakan.
Baik, terima kasih. Mohon maaf sebelumnya saya bertanya pakai bahasa Indonesia. Saya ingin bertanya karena tadi ketika story ini ketika diterapkan dalam penelitian hukum ya, terutama kan ini akan berkaitan dengan metodologi dalam penelitian hukum.
So the question, if I understood it, is how does one apply critical race theory as a methodology for doing legal research? There are lots of different starting points, but in a way, you kind of have to have a intuition to begin with. But you have to wonder: are there inequalities that exist between races that you might think the law creates somehow? So I'll give one example. So it is known that Blacks have far less wealth than whites do. I think the average wealth of a white family is like $150,000, and the average wealth of a Black family is $50. So that is a huge inequality. So part of what caused that, of course, is, slavery from before, but that can't be all of it, the time of explicit racial discrimination, because slavery ended in 1865, and there are white families who came to the US much later. So why has this happened? What's going on? And so one recent bit of legal research that I have recently been teaching, not doing myself, but teaching, that I was talking about is how does the tax code and other things contribute to differences in wealth? So if you notice an inequality, like what's called the racial wealth gap, the gap between white wealth and Black wealth, try to reconstruct what might have caused this through the law. So in this book that I've been teaching this past year, the author, Professor Dorothy Brown, investigates how this happened by noticing one thing that I told you about, some things about the federal income taxes and employment taxes, noticing how those have these racially disparate effects. but she discovered more things too. So when you sell your house for a profit, no taxes. You don't have to pay taxes on it. When you sell your house and it's a loss, you don't get to deduct that as a business loss as you typically do. So typically, if I buy a stock, I buy Amazon, if I sell it at a profit, I have to pay taxes on it. If I sell it as a loss, I deduct the loss. But houses are not treated like that for whatever reason in the US. You don't have to, for the most part, report the profit, but you also don't get to deduct the loss. This also has a racial consequence. White people tend to buy homes in white areas, and those tend to go up over time, and so you're more likely to realize a profit. Whereas Black families tend to buy in cheaper areas, some of them that become dilapidated because officials don't take care of those areas, so you more often are likely to sell at a loss. And so this is a thing that can exacerbate wealth. Some people are getting tax-free profits, and some people are losing money that they can't deduct. And this researcher found many more of these sorts of examples. And so a starting point might be to look at inequalities. Maybe you notice that there are income and wealth inequalities between people who live in Papua versus Java. What might cause that? Is it just the cities that are here and the cities there? Is that what it is? Are there other things that explain it? Are there land use policies that exist? Are there tax policies that exist? How easy is it to prove discrimination in employment? So those sorts of things might be the way that you uncover these sorts of things. Part of the reason why Black men earn less money than white men is that they are incarcerated at higher levels. So that's a possibility. Like, there's all sorts of things that you might go and investigate, and you kind of can't know until you go out and do the study, but that's how many critical race theorists begin their work, by noticing some inequalities and trying to look for the data that might explain how the inequality existed, persists, grows over time.
Thank you, Professor Donaldson. Tanggapan? Sudah? Clear. Any question? Ya, Mas Agus, silakan.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Indonesia juga. Terutama terkait dengan critical race theory ya. Kalau kita lihat salah satu tujuannya adalah bagaimana mendorong kebijakan yang inklusif dan mendorong perubahan sosial yang baik. Tentu dalam konteks ini bagaimana bisa meng-capture misalnya Indonesia punya sejarah yang panjang terkait dengan konflik ras etnis, misalnya Ambon yang ribuan orang meninggal, kemudian juga Sampit dan juga Maluku dan juga beberapa tempat yang lain. Ini menunjukkan bagaimana ini bisa mempelajari peristiwa-peristiwa konkret ini, kemudian kita mendorong bagaimana reformasi hukum ke depan dari periode hukum dan critical race theory ini bisa diterapkan. Mungkin juga mengkomparasikan belajar dari Amerika, di sana Mbak McLeod ya, kemarin beberapa kasus orang-orang kulitan yang dibuat kemudian dan sebagainya. Kira-kira reformasi hukum seperti apa dan bisa meng-capture istilah Indonesia kedepannya sebagai kita bahan pembelajaran kira-kira seperti apa. Mungkin itu, Mbak Dewi.
Oke, makasih Mas Agus. Masih diterjemahkan.
That is also a big question. So if I understand the question, part of it was asking, how can critical race theory help us understand past conflicts and also, sorry, what was the other point? Oh, yes, promote inclusive policies. Yes. So, there's a few things that I can say here. So, CRT began as a movement that was mostly focused, or only exclusively focused, on the situation between Blacks and whites in the US, mostly talking about from 1950 to 1980. But the tools of thinking about how there may be hidden forms of oppression that the law encodes is something that can be expanded. And people have used critical race lenses to think about the US and its colonial history, particularly its colonies in the Philippines and the South Pacific, in part because many of these colonial misadventures did not, again, have explicit racial language, terms, whatnot, but of course there were obvious racial overtones that if there was critical race theory at the time, people would have wanted to investigate. And continuing from that, how we understand the conflicts over those colonial possessions also can be informed by racial overtones. To give just one kind of example, the United States fought a war with Spain from 1898 to 1902. And in this war, the United States received the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and some other territories. The United States very quickly wanted to get rid of Cuba. They didn't want to keep it, though this was one of its things that it received for winning the war against Spain. And part of the reason why it wanted to get rid of Cuba had a racial character about who was there and whether they could be easily assimilated into American legal culture. Puerto Rico was thought to be slightly more assimilable, but not exactly. And so these are ways that one can kind of think about conflict in terms of critical race theory, how race operates to explain how a government might interact with certain conflicts. Thinking about like larger conflicts is probably stretching the theory a little bit. It may be possible to think that way. I mean, certainly the way that critical race theorists think about the Cold War, as I was explaining before, has a racial character to it. So the US has certain domestic developments because of its engagement in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So those are the ways that critical race theorists typically have thought about conflict and race. But I think there's room to talk even more expansively about how race and racial stereotypes govern how countries pursue alliances and enemies and these sorts of things. In terms of inclusivity, trying to make a more inclusive culture, I think that critical race theory has some tools for doing that. One of the things that critical race theorists are often stressing is how to create a society where we really do engage on terms of equality as opposed to hierarchy. So it's not just that we're all together, but all together on terms of equality. And they have suggested all sorts of things. I'll give just some examples. So critical race theorists have often argued that in workplaces, we need to change the laws to make it easier to prove racial discrimination. And the idea is that if racial discrimination is relatively easier to prove, then employers will be less likely to engage in that sort of behavior. And so the workplace will be a more egalitarian place. So right now, in order to prove discrimination, you have to prove that someone knew of your race and decided to take an adverse consequence against you because of your race. But that is really hard to prove. If you interview someone, hey, is this the reason why I didn't get the promotion? No, they're not going to tell you that. If you were to provide statistical evidence that no Black person has ever gotten a promotion here, that would not be sufficient, because what we must show is that the person knew this and decided not to give you the promotion on the basis of your race. And merely showing that no Black person has ever gotten the promotion does not show that at all. And so critical race theorists have argued, no, maybe instead we should allow a statistical test like that. If we can show no Black person or no Asian person has ever been promoted here or ever gotten hired here, that would be sufficient to show that there's discrimination. And so these are just some of the things that critical race theorists have introduced to try to give, to try to promote a more inclusive society in employment. They propose similar things in housing, college admissions, university admissions, things like that to better promote inclusivity. Some of those have been adopted and some of them have not.
Oke, presentasi. Ada lagi? Mas Gilang. Silakan, Mas.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rafternosan. Welcome to Indonesia, and I hope you enjoy Indonesia. Sorry, because I'm not fluent in English, I will ask using Indonesian language. Yang salah satu, kalau di Indonesia tadi kan sudah disampaikan ya, ada banyak etnis, tapi ada juga negara kita ini mengakui 5 agama, dan ada agama yang diberikan ruang untuk bisa menerapkan hukumnya dalam ruang publik bangsa, ya kan, atau ruang publik negara. Nah, sebetulnya seperti misalnya ada perda syariah atau hukum-hukum atau undang-undang berdasarkan agama, ya. Bagaimana critical race theory melihat ini? Apakah critical race theory relevan untuk menganalisis persoalan ini? Karena di samping soal kewajiban beragama,
To begin the lawsuit. The Supreme Court changed the rule. Now you needed to include enough evidence so that the court might think that it's true, which you might have thought the purpose of the case was to determine whether it's true, not just the pleading. But so this, of course, was something that critical race theorists were very interested to talk about. Why suddenly, when there are these Muslim Arab plaintiffs, do we have to have different rules about how you file lawsuits? So that is one such example. There are a number of men still who are detained at a US military base in Cuba. And there are lots of changes and violations of law that surround their continued detention 20 years, more than 20 years after 9/11. So there is lots of room to talk about how religion, but this kind of close kind of thinking of religion almost like race thing that happens in many countries. Jewish people, is that a religion or is it a race? And in the US, people tend to think of Muslims almost exclusively as if they are all Arabs, even though, of course, there are many non-Arabs who are Muslim as well. But there's this way of thinking about these things that lend themselves to the CRT method of wondering about various sorts of inequalities that happen and trying to figure out how we can rectify these situations. One more thing to mention, the very same rules that I was mentioning about proving discrimination in the workplace, this is the case for race and religion. And CRT theorists have argued that we should change that as well, because it's really difficult to prove, yes, we fired you because, or we didn't promote you because you're Muslim. It's very hard to prove that. And so often people who might actually have successful claims can't prove them in court, and so they don't. And so that leads to all sorts of bad consequences and discriminatory behavior festering. So I think that there's lots of room for thinking about religion and CRT. Now, about intersectionality, I think that there's lots of room for exploration here too. So the key claim of intersectional scholars is that one kind of identity and another kind of identity don't just add together, that the consequences may be very different. And it's worth exploring how those various parts of identity create certain kinds of outcomes for various people. And so I think that there's lots of room for these sorts of explorations as well. So I can imagine here, like I don't know very much about the certainly the history and certainly the contemporary conditions of social life here, but I can imagine researchers like you do, and you can do work to try to explain how life chances are made different for different groups of people, and how law facilitates that, or how law can rectify or change it, improve it. And so I think there's a lot of room for that sort of stuff. I also think that one might be benefited by doing such work in Indonesia where religion is officially tracked. So you have the data, so you can actually look at this, so it's on people's ID. That's the case in the US about race. Race is explicitly tracked by the government. So in the census, you have to mention your race, and for all sorts of things, like you apply for a loan at a bank, you have to mention your race. Which is there's interesting things about that. But since it's tracked in all of these places, we can look and see, like, oh, here's this inequality, here's this inequality. We can get big data sets and then do the sort of work to understand how inequality works. Where race is not explicitly tracked, like in countries like France, where it's basically not ever tracked by the government, and I gather here racial information is not tracked explicitly by the government. There might have to be different research methods that one would use in order to determine, like doing surveys and things like that, and then doing, power analysis to figure out if the set samples are representative and those sorts of things. I'm not like a social scientist of that kind, but that's, I think, how you might do that similar sort of work to do intersectional analysis and find out how race is affecting people's life chances.
Thank you, Professor.
Gak ada tanggapan ya? Oke. I think time's almost finished, but we have one question again. It's okay. One question from Pak Donald from on Zoom. Pak Donald, silakan Pak.
Ya, terima kasih. Thank you, Professor Rob Danielson. Let me introduce myself. My name is Henry. Your explanation is related to the racial problems experienced in America, but in other countries, the problem is not with race, but with religion. I want to ask first, can critical race theory be extended to other fields, such as religion issues? Second, what is the difference between legal race theory and critical social legal? Thank you, Prof.
Yeah. So the first question is, can critical race theory be extended to talk about religion? And yes, I think so, for the reasons I was mentioning before. I think some critical race theorists have already tried to think about how religion is often thought of in racial terms in the US, and similar investigations have happened. The next question, though, was about the difference between critical race theory and something else. I didn't hear the full name. Yes, that is a very good question. So, I think that there is a very loose connection between these things. So yeah, the question is the kind of critical theory, like the Frankfurt School, those sorts of people, versus the critical race theorists. Yeah, so I think that, as I said, this connection is very loose. So here's the best that I can do in terms of drawing a history. Critical legal studies in the US, which was begun in the 1970s, was a movement that was influenced somewhat by the Frankfurt School theorists. as those of you who know the Frankfurt School will know, they left Germany at the end of World War II, and many of them settled in the US for a time and taught generations of American students at major US universities. And so some of their kind of loose borrowing of things from Marx and thinking about how ideologies reflect material conditions and these sorts of things found their way into critical legal studies. Critical legal studies scholars were often concerned with how certain discourse about equality might mask how certain realities actually played out, how certain things that were supposed to be neutral actually reflected certain class positions or other interests. And so this kind of loose borrowing from Marxist thought characterized critical legal studies. And so they're borrowing from the kind of Frankfurt School, which itself is a interpretation of Marxist theory. And then critical race theory, as it began, was an offshoot of critical legal studies. And so some of the earliest thinkers, like Derek Bell, who was a professor at Harvard in the 1970s and 80s, he was initially a critical legal studies scholar, but started writing more and more about race. And at a number of these large academic conferences, the Black scholars at these conferences felt isolated from the mostly white critical legal studies scholars at these conferences. And eventually, over time, they split into different movements. So that's, I think, the best approximation I can give historically about the connection between, say, the Frankfurt School and critical race theory. I think that there's lots more than we can talk about. I think especially the convergence thesis, which, remember, is the claim that things will only improve for Blacks if they also improve for whites. That has a flavor of the thought that things will improve for the proletariat if this is okay for the bourgeoisie. This has a flavor of this sort of class-based analysis. And it is just as plausible in the one case as the other. I'll let you decide which one is plausible. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you, Professor Nelson. Pak Donald sudah oke, Pak, clear?
Ya, clear.
Ya, kasih Pak. That's the last question. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our session today. On behalf of the Legal Theories and Doctrine Research Group in the Research Center for Law, I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to Professor Ralph Nelson for sharing his expertise and to all of you for your active participation. We hope today's lecture has provided us with new perspective and insight into normative jurisprudence and critical race theory. Please stay tuned for our upcoming even in the guest lecture series. Thank you and have a great day. We'll give you the appreciation.
Gimana saya Tapi itu suruh datang semua. Di anunya ini benar sih perwakilan. Jadi gue mau itu tuh begini. Jadi aspek itu ya. Objektif ya.